Welcome back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm really excited to have the CEO and founder of Walnut, Roshan Patel. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Just a brief introduction and dive right in. Roshan's the founder and CEO of Walnut. It's a company with a mission to expand access to healthcare with a financial solution to the high cost of healthcare in our country. Walnut turns medical bills into flexible payment plans and is able to offer the low cost payment and able to offer lower cost payment plans. It expands access to healthcare for patients who would otherwise struggle to pay for healthcare. Walnut's backed by Plaid, Gradient Ventures, and other top investors across the ecosystem. And before we get into that, I learned a bit about your background, a bit about the story, but going a bit macro, could you talk a bit about the healthcare situation in the US and the medical debt of patients in this country and some of the early indications of what inspired you to launch this business?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm sure almost everyone listening to this has had an interaction with the healthcare system at some point in their life, and it probably was not a great one. Healthcare is extremely broken in this country, especially paying for it. And over half the country has medical debt, which is just an absurd statistic. Most countries have their healthcare figured out. US tends to be a bit of a unique situation. But how this all started was a couple of years ago, I had a family member get a large medical bill from getting into a car accident. It was not a tragic accident or anything like that, had a fractured leg, got, fixed up, and then we got the hospital bill, and it was a couple $1,000s. And so just going through that process of figuring out what to do when you get asked to pay $3,000 and you don't have $3,000 was kind of a nightmare. Like trying to dispute that bill, negotiate the bill with the hospital was impossible. We asked if we could pay over time and they said no. And then we got sent to a collections agency, which has a real impact on your financial future. It goes down on your credit report and makes it hard to get a loan or a mortgage or rent an apartment. So it has real world consequences. But this was around the time in 2017 where Affirm and Klarna and a lot of the e-commerce buy now, pay later companies were taking off. And I thought to myself, why is it so easy to buy a Peloton in 2 clicks over time, but to pay a hospital bill over time is impossible? So that was sort of the genesis of the idea about 5 years ago at this point.
And I think a lot of people also probably watching this and before you launch this, medical debt just seems like this scary headline item, but a lot of people don't believe that they would ever fall into it. But there are several middle upper class people also in the country that just get burdened by medical debt when they least expected it. Can you talk a bit about some of those human stories of how that happens? Like, what are some of the areas where folks are most susceptible? What sorts of surgeries? What sort of accidents or emergencies that happen? Because that it's led to such a big issue in the country. Because I know on your website you have a crazy statistic about the number of bankruptcies that people had to file as a result of medical debt.
Yeah, there's about 500,000 bankruptcies every year that are filed due to medical debt. I would say that it compounds the problem that a lot of people find themselves in when, most of America is living paycheck to paycheck. And then when you add in a huge unexpected cost, that causes a huge spiral. But even like you're saying, if you're middle or upper class, like you can be susceptible to a lot of large healthcare costs. Perhaps, you go to a physician that's out of network and, you were transported there in an ambulance and had no say in where you actually got that treatment. And, a lot of treatments can be tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how your insurance is billed. So even though you may have a high income, you may not always be able to afford what care you're actually getting.
And why, in your opinion, I guess in your experience, has it reached this point where a private company like Walnut has to step up and solve this problem? And you saw that issue of Affirm, Klarna taking that business model, adopting it to healthcare, which seems pretty obvious in the general sense, but obviously much more complicated. But can you give us a sense of some of those regulations or early hurdles in those first 6 months of launching this that you needed to face and figure out?
Absolutely. Like launching a lending company, that's what we are at our core, is extremely hard to do in the US, especially in a complicated industry like healthcare. So even just getting a lending business off the ground, you have to figure out the right licenses you need, whether those are lending licenses, collection licenses. You need to actually set up a lot of policies and procedures for how you're handling data and making sure you're doing all the right anti-money laundering checks and making sure you're not actually handing out money to known terrorists. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that you need to do to even launch your product that, this might not be the case if you're just launching like an e-commerce app or a SaaS company. And then within healthcare, just how you're treating data, making sure you're HIPAA compliant, not actually falling under any like anti-kickback statute regulations. So we did a fair amount of legal work, both on the fintech and regulatory side before we even went live. But we were able to do so pretty quickly. So we went from founding to launch in 6 months, which, is probably, analogous or comparable to most startups.
Interesting. And then what else happened in that 0 to 1 besides like the regulation and the legislation that you had to go through and figure out in terms of what types of doctors you decided to work with? You went B2B approach as opposed to direct to consumer. How were you thinking about that entire model and some initial tests that you had run in the beginning?
Yeah. So when we first contemplated Walnut, we thought about going direct to consumer. And the big blocker was that we didn't know how to monetize. We didn't want to charge the consumer like fees or interest because we didn't want to increase the cost of healthcare, which was the problem we were trying to solve, right? So we had to get more creative and we thought, well, we could go and partner with healthcare providers who could then offer us to their patients. And we know that healthcare providers often do not have a 100% collections rate. So there was opportunity for us to help the healthcare provider capture more revenue and get paid faster. And so we currently go B2B to C through healthcare providers, and they pay us a transaction fee for each patient because we're helping them get paid more and get paid faster. One of the challenges we faced was once we made that decision, we were like, okay, let's go straight to hospitals and get a bunch of those signed up. And then we're quickly humbled by the sales process and sales cycle of the hospital systems. So we had to find like private practices and smaller independent doctors to start with.
Interesting. And I think there's probably a lot of founders that want to double click on that and spend more time there because they are thinking about that same sales channel. And I think most are usually advised by VCs who may be a bit ignorant that don't go door to door for the small practices, go after the larger ones, focus on those, get those big contracts. Can you talk about your experience on both sides on the sales channel, how you've actually mastered going after these smaller physician clinics, which I read about recently? You're focused on dermatology, fertility, and dentistry as your starting point. But a bit about the sales channel on that side, and then on the health systems, what you encountered there.
Absolutely, yeah. Like it is like selling in healthcare is extremely hard, even with the smaller private practices. Like it's really hard to get a doctor on the phone, even if you're a patient of theirs. So to do it and try and sell them something is, dialing up the difficulty to 11. So, what we found success with is building a brand and creating a lot of awareness with patients. So we get a fair amount of patients coming to us directly every day asking for, hey, you work with this doctor, or hey, can you serve this type of treatment? And all we do is we bring that patient to the doctor they've mentioned or one of our partner doctors and, just bring them a patient and say, this patient can't pay, like they want to pay through Walnut. Do you want to give it a shot? And we found that actually bringing them business and demonstrating the product with one patient is a lot better than trying to do a cold call and pitch them something while they're busy. So once they see how it works and see how easy it is, then it really makes it easy to sign a longer term partnership. So that's where we found success with the smaller private practices.
Got it. Okay. And then could you share, it is a fintech business at the same time of being a healthcare business, but can you share a bit more, I don't know if you're willing to, but on how you underwrite patient populations? I mean, there is some risk that you are taking on of helping patients pay these bills, but collections, like you're saying, or you're helping providers collect faster or more accurately or efficiently. Can you talk a bit about the underwriting process and how that's evolved over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So most lenders primarily look at credit bureau data. So things like your credit score, it'll have things like the number of credit cards you have, or if you have a mortgage, things like that. The problem with that is a third of America is thin file or credit invisible, meaning they don't have a credit score, or they do have one, but it's not very reliable. So about a third of America just gets auto rejected by most lenders. So we come in where we can actually approve patients that others may be overlooking. And we do that by looking at more data points. So while we do look at credit bureau data, we look at a few thousand data points on each patient in real time. So that can include things like your cash flow. So patients can opt in and provide their bank statements through Plaid. And so we can actually see your income, your spending, and savings on a daily basis, and calculate based on your cash flow if you can repay a loan. And this captures things that are not shown in the credit bureau files. So perhaps you're driving for Uber on the weekends and generating extra income, or babysitting on the weekends. And that information is really helpful to know. And we can approve patients that don't have any credit history, which is a huge part of the population. So we run all of these data points through a machine learning algorithm, and helps us price and assess the risk that we're taking to have industry-leading approval rates.
Got it. Okay. And I guess that's where Plaid's investment and Gradient Ventures, which is Google's AI fund, have both invested in Walnut. Could you share a bit more about that investment, sort of partnerships that it's brought with that, how you thought about the fundraise process early? I think you guys raised during COVID as well. So maybe a bit more about what you learned from raising capital from folks like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. We went through Plaid's accelerator called FinRise, and that was really helpful for us just to connect with other fintech founders, and also be able to use Plaid's products, which are really valuable for our product. We went through a fundraise, two fundraises, I guess, during COVID. So our seed round and Series A. This was also my first time raising capital as a first-time founder, so all of it was a learning experience. But having formerly been on the VC side of the table, it was interesting to be on the founder side of the table at this point. So, I think especially we just closed our Series A in the spring, around where the market downturn started happening. And I think what was interesting is that we got a lot more questions around profitability, unit economics, default rates. So things that are affecting our bottom line, versus in our seed round, which was in 2021, it was all just about mission, vision, sales, and just growth. None of those questions about how do you actually make money really were ever asked. Yeah.
Interesting. And like, as a CEO that's navigating that shift from 2021 to 2022, and the change in the environment, the fundraising, and the focus on profitability, how do you sort of guide your team towards that, or kind of stay disciplined with chasing the big picture and managing burn? Can you share some lessons? Because I know your background is also in equities trading, VC, and kind of top finance institutions. So maybe helping us understand how you manage all that, also the bold entrepreneurial vision with the grounded in reality finance perspective too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, for any lending business, it's really easy to lend out money. The hard part is getting paid back. And so for us, since day one, it's always been about profitability. We didn't change how we run our business just because VCs are asking different questions. For us, we are closely monitoring the macro environment, and, we'll, hopefully build an enduring company over, 10 plus years, and we'll go through multiple market cycles. And usually, lenders adapt their underwriting models and standards in different market environments. So we'll do the same, and probably lean towards being more conservative, but our overall philosophy hasn't changed since day one.
Got it. And then I think it's just I know we're almost up on time, but the other, you took buy now, pay later as one business model that's worked in other industries and adopted it towards healthcare to try to fix this very complex industry that we're working in. What else have you seen? This might just be too general of a question, in terms of business models or acquisition channels or sales techniques in other industries that work well within healthcare that other founders might be able to learn from or build businesses around?
Yeah, I think one strategy I mentioned is really B to C to B. So if you can generate a lot of awareness and like hyper focus it in a certain geography, and if we're talking about healthcare, like a certain specialty, you can bring a mass of consumers to a healthcare provider and get your foot in the door that way. And that's the approach we're taking with larger health systems. So that's an interesting sales strategy. For business models, as a fintech company, there's a lot of different ways you can go. One interesting thing we're working on is issuing cards to patients. So they'll get either a virtual card or physical card, and that allows us to make money on interchange. So, when you swipe a card, it'll go through the card networks, and since we're issuing the cards, we can get a share of that revenue. Which can allow us in some cases not to even charge the patient or healthcare provider a transaction fee. So now you're selling something that adds a lot of value to the healthcare provider and it's free. So the barrier to signing up is really low.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I guess that's one teaser into where Walnut goes from here. But what else do you have planned for that enduring company that you're building in terms of the vision towards Series B and beyond that? If you can share some thoughts on the future.
Yeah. So we primarily work with healthcare providers, but there are so many different stakeholders in healthcare. So we're starting to build more of a platform that can work with entities that are not providers. So that could be insurance companies, it could be employers, it could be benefits brokers. So we're trying to build more of an agnostic platform that can add value throughout the entire system. So one example is, we currently have employers that offer Walnut as an employee benefit to their employees, giving each employee a Walnut card that they can spend at any healthcare provider. And once they spend on that card, it breaks up the payment into installments. So that's kind of an interesting thing that we've launched recently.
Great. That's very exciting. Well, Roshan, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate you packing in so many insights into the show, and I wish you all the best, and thank you for the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.